Good evening. Good evening, everybody. Today we'll discuss about poetry exclusively, modern Australian poetry, and before we start discussing about poetry, we must know about the culture and of Australia, political issues, and the problem of immigration, and the contribution of indigenous people, aboriginal people, and the contribution of women uh, to Australian literature. So, the primary objective of this unit is to examine specific political, social, and cultural issues that have shaped Australia from 1970 to the present day. The secondary objective is to use these issues to lead in to an examination of the themes and content of contemporary Australian poetry. When we say contemporary Australian poetry, the poem Brood Bean Sermon evokes sensitively but clearly a specific time and place. The place and time and the landscape of Australia is very important whenever we analyze something about poetry, Australian poetry. First, it is clearly set in a time when belief in Orthodox Christianity is at something of a low ebb. The preacher of the sermon, elsewhere thought of as a lecturer, is a patch of beans. The first line stresses that commitment is slack and all are without belief. So anarchy has loosened upon the earth, and we are without belief. A first note also the selective parody of the Lord's Prayer. The complete line in the Bible is forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. Here, however, in the italicized phrase, the beings are represented as saying trespass against us. In other words, they ask to be picked, which is a comic inversion of the original prayer. Next, the poem is equally clearly set in a time of a protest against militarization. The beings are compared to unenthusiastic raw recruits in the first verse, who are yet to learn to be alert as they turn up in uniform. Mint Air Force Decorum, which is slovenly deal with this response to Cold War crisis in Vietnam. More specifically, but for the moment, just to make a mental note of this point, then look at the way in which the physicality of the human presence is established. The beings are quote unquote upright with water like man. They are fleshy and keel over all ways. Feminist poetry in Australia, as I hope to so briefly and comprehensively, is deeply involved with an analysis of what constitutes the male presence. And look at how the poem evokes the spirit of um, place. This is no longer the Australia of outback or ocean, or even the Australia of city and bush. Although the winds are described in the third verse as if they constitute a forest, they could as easily be the product of a vegetable patch in suburbia. The new and complicated tensions of such a landscape will be examined and just file this possibility away in our mind. What, for instance, do we think could be the consequences of internalizing this seascape in this way, as the winds are described as quote unquote minute green dolphins? Finally, we can ask the question about what quality of life is evoked by such a poem. What are the consequences of suburban pastoral, and what kind of a human presence does the broad bean sermon conjure up? Most of all, what are the issues which challenge contemporary Australian in poems such as this? So we'll come to analyze the political issues which um, is very much present, overwhelmingly present in contemporary Australia and poetry. Republicanism, the closing decades of the 20th century saw a growth in popular sentiment in Australia that favored complete independence from Britain. The Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, (SEATO), lasted from 1954 to 1975 and comprised the countries like Australia, New Zealand, Thailand, Pakistan, the Philippines, the United States of America, and Britain. It came to an end largely because its member states were unable to agree on a common policy in Vietnam. Britain insisted that um, Vietnam was not an issue that concerned her directly, while Australia supported American intervention in Vietnam. Even before this, Britain's membership of the European Economic Community (EEC) had been the subject of difference with Australia. The increase in pro-Republican sentiment was a feature of Paul Keating's government. Finally, in 1986, the Australia Act ensured Australia's total independence of Britain. These acts comprised a statute of the Westminster Parliament and a statute of the Canberra Parliament. Until then, Britain had retained residual powers of intervention in Australian federal and state matters. With the passing of the Australia Acts, the Privy Council in Britain lost the right to hear appeals from Australian courts. The status of Queen Elizabeth II as sovereign of Australia, however, remained unchanged. She signed the Australia Acts while on a visit to the country in 1986. So this is about the political issues and how uh, the issue of Vietnam has been the cause of rift between Britain and America and Australia. America and Australia were in one um, group. From 1965 to 1973, there was a prolonged civil war between the communist state of North Vietnam, which was tacitly supported by the then Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and the non-communist state of South Vietnam, supported by the United States of America. On one level, this was a phase of the Cold War, the ongoing struggle for world domination being fought out between the two superpowers and their blocs. On another level, though, there was uh, there, though, though the Vietnam crisis was a testing time for Australia, the Australian government under Robert Menzies enthusiastically backed American involvement in Vietnam despite Britain's refusal to intervene. Australia intervened militarily in Vietnam, sending its first batch of combat troops in 1965. In 1968, the Australian military presence in Vietnam was at its strongest. Nonetheless, Vietnam was not a cause popular with the Australian public, and there was widespread condemnation of the government's policy of military intervention. Protest was exacerbated when Menzies introduced a system of conscription by ballot. In 1972, Australian forces withdrew, but the human cost of Vietnam was crippling. Uh, and the poem Homecoming by Bruce Dale, um, describes the facelessness of futility of militarism. Quote, all day after day, they are bringing them home. They are picking them up, those they can find, and bringing those home. They are zipping them up in green plastic bags. They are taking them now in Salgon in the Mount mortuary colony coolness. They are giving them names. They are rolling them out of the deep freeze lockers. For the military personnel killed in the war, the homecoming in body bags is ironic. They return voiceless, nameless, and faceless. Their only identity is derived from their dog tags. But while both republicanism and Vietnam challenge the contemporary Australian immigration in terms of foreign affairs, it must be said that domestic affairs also bring their challenges, and it is these at which we will um, have a clear look. The social issues, in the category of social issues, we have the problem of immigration, and which needs a bit brief discussion. In the 20th century, immigration became a vexed issue in Australia. On the one hand, one concern of government has been that expressed in the phrase, the fight. quote unquote the White Australia policy. The 1902 Act supported this policy by requiring a dictation test in a European language by the administered administered to any potential settler. In 1905, the act was modified so that the text now covered a entirely European language. The dictation test continued in use till 1958. The 1925 Act empowered the Governor General to refuse entry to a group of alliance he might consider undesirable on the economic or the uh, racial score. The act was highly used. The ban chiefly administration 1945 to 1949 continued the White Australia policy. Simultaneously, however, another concern of government policy has been to allow immigration when it has seemed enabling. As a member of the Commonwealth, like every other corporate settlement, Australia has been largely the product of generations of immigrants, comprising both pioneers and settlers. After World War II, the Australian government agreed to the request of the Allies to allow immigration largely from southern Europe and also to help with resettlement of ex-servicemen. The challenge of immigration in statistical terms can be gauged from the fact that against the 750,000 immigrants who arrived between 1860 and 1900, 3.5 million arrived between 1945 and 1988. And so this is about the problem of immigration. Then comes the next important issue, that is suburbanization. As a result, in past part of changing patterns of immigration, the population in Australian cities grew overwhelmingly. More than 2 million new Australians entered the country between 1946 and 1966, many from parts of southern Europe that had high birth rates. The expansion rate of the coastal cities went up. The result was that the demographic face of Australia changed radically. The early poets, 1788 to 1901, had explored the outback and ocean in their work, and more modern poets examined the dichotomy between the city and the bush. Contemporary poets are confronted with the challenge of suburbia, with the cities expanding rapidly and spreading outwards through new towns and sub-cities. By 1986, only 16.4% of the total population of 15.8 million lived outside towns. More than 50% of the population was concentrated in Brisbane, Melbourne, and Sydney. So, the traditional theme of Australian literature, the desire to overcome the overpowering land, now alters in contemporary terms to become a desire to deal with the spread of suburbia, the dismal hin- hinterland, which is neither metropolis nor outback, but a territory being rapidly overrun by new townships. But how does the suburbia alter the quality of life? Mm, Bruce Doyle offers an insight into this question in the following sonnet, Drifters. Quote, one day soon he will tell her it's time to start packing, and the kids will yell truly and get wildly excited for no reason. and the brown kelpie pop will start dashing about, tripping everyone up, and she'll go out to the vegetable patch and pick all the green tomatoes from the vines. And notice how the oldest girl is close to tears because she was happy here, and how the youngest girl is beaming because she wasn't. Now, this gives us a kind of expansion of the city and the problem of population, all these things. And the rest is even more interesting. And the first thing she will put on the trailer will be bottling set she never unpacked from Gorbadale. And then, when the loaded youth bombs down the drive past the blackberry canes with their last shriveled fruit, she won't even ask why they are leaving this time or where they are heading for. She will only remember how, when they came here, she held out her hands bright with berries, the first of the season, and said, "Make a wish, Tom, make a wish." So, there is a curiously shifting and rootless character. It is true that this particular family is without a permanent home, but the suburban landscape itself seems to be descended from no particular source. There is the uneasy coexistence of town and country. The caravan and the bustling set suggest perpetual driving between towns, but the fruit vines and vegetable pears um, suggest the country over which the town has sprawled. There is also the shabby and gentle existence that the family drags out. The only they only just escape poverty, are vaguely mindful that appearances have to be kept up, and yet they never have enough money to put their roots down anywhere. There is also the emotional dislocation, the toll exacted by suburbia. The fluctuating feelings of the wife and the children are the direct result of this kind of existence. So, here we come to the next issue, that is another important issue, the cultural issue, and issue of indigenous culture is very important as far as contemporary Australian poetry is concerned. The critical point to notice about contemporary Australian poetry is um, that it does not so much represent the experience of indigenous peoples, but present it so that it speaks for itself. One, one strand of writing a clearly nostalgic, it yearns for a golden age, which it believes to have been more gentle and kind than the present, when the land was yet in the possession of its original inhabitants. That is very much the tone of Wallace Crabbe's Prince Pen- Panoptics, which attempts an intensely romanticized reconstruction of the past. Quote, "It was another race with a slender hold indeed on the intel of prehistory, a uh, gramnivorous people, gentle, bandy, green-eyed, who left so little mark on the lots and crops of time. Their edges unremarkable, threads pitifully few, and their passions blown away like the long lavender wind." So the use of imagery is very much important here, and what we can do what we can present is very interesting, and this poem suggests that uh, the indigenous culture is very much at the center of the poem. It is shown to be gentle and delicate. Elsewhere in the poem, we are told of the wonder and magic conjured up by the indigenous people. They are said to mythologize the very heavens, giving the stars wonderfully evocative names. At the same time, as seen in the verse above, this very gentleness proves their undoing. Um, More violent cultures erase the presence of the white indigenous people. Even their hold on material goods is slight, and the harsh processes of history erode the fragile remnants and artifacts of their material culture. Then we will come to know about the world of women, how women or things about and regarding women has a very prominent presence in Australia, contemporary Australian poetry. The themes of women and their needs and empowerment are not in themselves new. An early evocation of the constraints placed on women can already be found in the work of Judith Wright, whose poem Small Town Dance is very clear on the subject. Quote, but women know the scale of possibility, the limits of opportunity, the fence, how little chance there is of getting out. Unquote. What is radical in contemporary Australian poetry is the refusal to set parameters to that which is acceptable in women's experience. There is a complete setting aside of boundaries, even physical boundaries. A good example of this radicalism is Faye Vivek's uh, poem To a Seahorse. The seahorse, a species in which the male rather than the female helps to hatch and rear the young, is used to explore the possibility of the reversal of gender determined rules. Owing to a biological quirk, the eggs of the seahorse are hatched in a pouch beneath the tail of the male of the species. This quirk allows the poet to question stereotypical expectations about the roles of the male and female at the very outset. Snouter refers to the seahorse because of its markedly projecting uh, nose, wall-eyed, sweet, feeble, uh, corseted, and pouting are usually terms associated with the description of the female face and figure. And the opening of the poem is very interesting. Wall-eyed snouter, sweet, feeble, translucent, tiny anodes, tweeting on your rocker, pouting corseted in rings of bone, flesh flaps, fanning the tides as you totter and roll forward, but never too forward as sea. The general effect is to mock the impact uh, biological pressures put on cultural stereotypes. As a rule, much to the anger of feminists, the identity of women is determined by biological necessity, the fact of reproduction. Yuki demonstrates the sheer idiocy of such cultural stereotyping. by endowing a male entity, the seahorse, with a reproductive role and also with so-called female attributes. The point, the feebleness, the corseted appearance that go along with this stereotype. By the end of the poem, gender stereotyping has been demolished. Once the eggs are hatched, as the poet royally remarks to the seahorse, hatched in your warmth, fledged in your strength, they would be made to trust women after this. Jiviki's poem is a representative poem, and the way in which the age reinvents the words, the worlds which women inhabit by seeing aside inherited biological and psychological identities. So this is the women or radical women at their best. Then to sum up, contemporary Australian poetry speaks for a time and space shaped by continuing change. Politically, Australia is moving away from Britain as the Republican movement, an expression of an age that has seen the collapse of SITO, Southeast Atlantic Treaty Organization, and the Vietnam War gathers momentum. Socially, demographic patterns alter under pressures of immigration and suburbanization, with the radical experiments of presentation of the experiences of indigenous people and the experiences of women. Australia's cultural lineage continually reinvents itself. So, contemporary Australian poetry has really come up with these social and political changes, cultural changes, and that brings us to the next unit, unit number two, and we'll read about two representative poets, Bruce Darby and Dai and Liz Murray. Bruce Dai, 1930, worked initially as a manual laborer after dropping out of high school at the age of 16. While working on a construction site at a university, he recalls having thoughts as he looked at the students. Quote, "What lucky bastards! I wish I was one of them." Unquote. He went to night school, matriculated, and in 1954 registered for a part-time arts degree at Melbourne University. Its faculty at this time included such practicing poets as Chris Wallace Crabbe, whose work we will discuss later, and Vincent Buckley. Doy joined the Royal Australian Air Force in 1959 and served for 9 years, which included a stint in Malaysia. But by the time he left the Air Force, he had married and also published 2 volumes of poetry. He taught at Queensland and then held a lecturership at the Darling Downs Institute of Higher Education. He has since obtained a doctorate, a frequently anthologized poet. He limits the number of his poems in any one anthology to 6. Why? We might ask this question. Because he wishes the other poets to be also represented in these collections. Then let's say A. Murray, born 1938, dominated the 1970s. His rise to fame in Australia has been said to follow his growing popularity as an Australian poet in cultural centres such as New York, London, and Edinburgh. He has been described as natural food for the seminar because of the discursive style, and has often been the subject of study at seminars despite it being so assertive, a spokesman of anti-academic values. Now, let us discuss the poem at Sarger's funeral by Bruce Dye briefly. Way has been described as home suburbians, Wallace Grabe has said him, and that should in itself suggest the social context of his work. The pressure of suburbia, and indeed an example of Dye's own writing on the theme, have been set out already. And the social markers in the poem at Sajar's funeral. So please bring out so many pleasing issues. And first, we can see the nickname Sajar, the phrase lonely as a sag or cormorant, a sea bird, is a colloquial expression used to denote a compulsive loner or an odd person. Here, however, the sense would appear to be more general, slangy term used to denote a person who has a casual sex mm, indiscriminately with a number of women. So the sense established is that of a lower middle class drifter with no particular job and with no particular emotional attachments. Then the circle which has come to Mount Sajar, his friends are well oiled, a colloquialism indicating that they are drunk. The only one of his women friends to turn up is the casually named Bay Whiteside, who has clearly been one of the women he has picked up in his time. Then you can see the second-hand car he used, called the Sag wagon. It has probably been the site of most of his one-night stands. It is run down, a regular old bone shaker, and has a cheap nylon upholstery. Then the establishment of suburbia of the heart, a sense that socioeconomic rootlessness extends into emotional rootlessness. Even the moment of Sajar's death is given a ring of commonness. The phrase quote unquote cut with his breeches down to death suggests how he was taken completely by surprise or caught off guard by death, as if he were surprised in the midst of one of his casual uh, reactions. Then, when you analyze the literary context of the literary context of the poem is again indicated by the title. The fact that it centers around a funeral suggests first that it is an elegy. Conventionally, an elegy is a work of art which mourns the passing away of an individual or an age, or also mourns the passing away of a set of values associated with the individual associated with the individual or age. Yet, This is not so much conventional as it is an ironic elegy. If Sajar's friends are more or less tongue-tied during the funeral, it is because they feel that nothing of what they know of his life is appropriate to recall at a solemn ceremony. Besides, we can also think about the ironic framing which the poem offers. One line of argument is the ironic anti-heroic line I have just mentioned. It is just mentioned here. In sharp contrast to this is the wholly somber religious line of a commentary that runs through the poem. Even if the professional attitude of the clergyman conducting the service is discounted, there is still a somber list of abstractions to be considered. The phrase, quote unquote, the resurrection and the life is used by Jesus to explain to his disciples that that is precisely what he is, the promise of eternal life to those who follow him. So the phrase has a dignity that is otherwise lacking in the shiftless world of Sajar and his friends. Moreover, consider the various kinds of loss with which the poem is concerned. On the wholly personal level, and whatever significance the event may or may not have for his friends, the death of Sajar uh, means that his mother-in-law loses a son. No mention is made of any other family members. In terms of cultural deprivation, the elegy mounts the passing away of love, the battered car, the awkward friends, babe Whiteside, who will go thus far and no farther, testify to a way of life from which love is absent. On what on the religious level is also pointed out here. The religion testifies not just to a world in which Orthodox belief is at low ebb, but also raises a theological question. If death has caught Sajar unawares, he has he been snatched away before he could prepare himself for death? In other words, does this elegy reveal the loss of grace or divine goodness as seen in this snatching away, so to speak, of Sajar? So, this is very interesting and radically different from what we have already read about Australian poetry. Then, when we come to the text, I will try to we can analyze David's characters here. Um, his characters show David to be sharp but not conscious, ironic rather than cynical, frank but not outspoken. The first point made is that there is a yearning gap between Sajar's friends and his mother. The funeral service means a great deal um, to her in the sense that abstract concepts such as the resurrection and the life are real to her in a way they are not real to Sajar's friends. On their side, they are unable to tell Sajar's mother what they really think of him. This makes the speaker, whose monologue is the poem, feel somehow inadequate. A consciousness of their own inappropriate appearance and behavior is responsible for the guilty smile which is evoked by their presence and their memories. The rundown car and the world of rundown relationships suggest two kinds of emotion. The obvious sense is that that of sterility in a world where both objects and people are rusting and decaying. However, despite the ironic detachment with which the world is opened up, there is also a certain amount of reluctant affection. The feeling his friends have for Swadha, which they cannot communicate, is shown when they try to crank his car into life. Again, while Whiteside draws the line at going down to the graveside, she has at least turned up, although reluctantly. The residual signs of affection suggests that Doyle's tone in the poem is ironic but not condemnatory. He is open about the limitations of his characters, but does not, as for instance, with Webb, nail down blame or even responsibility. All are fellow sufferers in the suburbia of the heart which he evokes, and I think, therefore, that the tone is one of compassion rather than judgment. Even at the end, Sadar's friends prefer, as the speaker says, to remain silent rather than to have a laugh at his expense. So here we can see the context of or the analysis of another poem, the quality of sprawl and blood, the quality of sprawl, and the poem is another important poem of Les Murray, and it is a city poem. Both are city poems, and the quality of sprawl defines a certain attitude to life, almost entirely in terms of urban history and anecdote. Blood sets up a particular contrast between urban life and rural life. The difference is that neither of these poems by Murray is exclusively suburban. Both look at life in small towns, but neither uses small town life as its main subject. So, the quality of sprawl juxtaposes two opposite worlds. The first verse, through its anecdote of the farmer, sets out the world of rural Australia against the world of urban technology, which it adapts to suit its purposes. The world of rural Australia, which uses the aeroplane to farm, is evoked again in the second verse, but contrasted this time with the world of cosmopolitan crassness, that stupidity and callously lights with cigars with a $10 currency notes or very expensive mink coats with common canvas suits. Then there is the world of popular culture captured in the reference to the Hollywood action film Never Give One Inch. Against this is placed the world of high culture conjured up by the reference to the 19th century painter W.J.M. Turner. The world of medieval European history, conjured up by the references to Simon de Montfort and Pope Alexander III, is set against the world of contemporary Australia, as seen in the different anecdotes in verse 7. Finally, there is the context of Christian thought, in verse 2 and 8 that Murray uses to explain his central theme. Murray takes a great deal of time and trouble to set up pluralistic contests because he wants to demonstrate that the chief virtue of Spral, the attitude he describes and glorifies in this poem, is that it is an attitude that stands above all contexts. In itself, it is superior to any or to all the worlds, social, artistic, and historical, evoked in the poem. This may seem to be a paradoxical statement, but I think Murray sets the challenge of understanding it before his readers. Then, Blood is at first glance a more clear-cut poem. The second poem by Murray is Blood, and it's very clear-cut. If two, it too is constructed on the basis of contrasted contexts. Only in this case there is just one pair of contrasted worlds throughout the poem. There is the world of the city from which the speaker comes, and there is a world of the farm from which his cousin comes. While killing a pig for the table, the cousin realizes that the speaker's stay in the city has made him queermiss or unnecessarily fastidious. Curiously, as the cousin points out, this squirmishness has made the city-bred speaker cruel, for the speaker now thinks only of his comfort and not of the animal. He hauls the corn cob at the pig without much concern as to whether the pig will be unnecessarily injured. Hence the line in verse 2, it is made you cruel, all that smart city life. The cousin tries to kill the pig with one plunge of the knife to minimize its pain. In that sense, despite his slaughter of the pig, he might be said to be kind. The city-bred speaker may or may not at first be comfortable with slaughter, but that is because he is mindful of his own comfort rather than that of the animals. Again, though, as with the quality of sprawl, any further explication must take place within a specifically literary context. So, what is the literary context to this poem Blood? The poem is an exercise in definition. Like all definitions, works in two ways. It establishes what its subject is and also what its subject is not by setting up a line of similitudes or comparisons and dissimilitudes or contrasts. As the subject of the definition is a certain state of mind or a certain attitude to life, it seems that it is a definition that works by making the abstract concrete. Hence, hence its use of anecdotes and examples. At the same time, it is a definition that falls into the category of humorous verse and indeed at times seems to be an example specifically of nonsense verse. Nonetheless, nonsense verse is that which deliberately suspends the principle of reason in order to make a statement. A good example of this occurs in verse 5. Mm, quote unquote, a sprawl occurs in art. The 15th to 21st lines in a sonnet, for example. On the level of fact, this is ludicrous. As a sonnet contains only 14 lines, it stands to reason that a poem which exceeds this limit, whether by having 15 lines or 21, is not a sonnet. At the same time, Murray has suspended reason for a particular purpose. He wants to show that this poem, his poem lives out its own theme, namely that an attitude which it sets aside boundaries to fulfill itself is admirable. The literary context of blood is a little more difficult to establish since it is a response to various kinds of writing. The first point is an account not just of the slaughter of the pig, but also that it is an account of an admonition, a violation of a rule given by Jehovah to the Jews under the leadership of Moses, as recorded in the Old Testament around 1405 BC. And according to the ruling of the pig is unclean, quote, and the swine, though he divide the hoof and be cloven footed, yet he cheweth not the cord, he is unclean to you. Of their flesh shall you not eat, and their carcass you shall not touch. They are unclean to you. So, this is the allusion to Old Testament, where God makes a far more liberal statement. Next, a book that has accounts of more dynamic and open community that is international. These old restrictions are put aside, and the statement made is simply this: when Peter, an Orthodox Jew, refuses to eat the meat set before him in a dream because it is unclean, he has a voice from heaven saying, "What God hath cleansed, that call not thou common." So, this allusion to the Bible and the Old Testament and the New Testament makes the poem Blood, a complicated text and the theme of what constitutes right human conduct. Then Leviticus is concerned with the need for holiness on the part of Jews in the dealings with Jehovah and Deuteronomy is concerned with the need for obedience on the part of this race. So, when we come to the text, we find so many complicated and complex allusions to Christianity. Verse 1 speaks of the contest between the Rolls Royce company and a farmer. Rolls Royce, when this poem was written in 1983, was the premier British car company associated with that all that is exclusive in terms of style and comfort in British car design. All its car evoke a world of grandeur and luxury. Any farm vehicle is by design and purpose a utility model. So when the Australian farmer customizes a, a rules to meet its need for a utility vehicle, he does two things. He indicates that his personal needs must be met even if an inherited idea, the equation of a rules with luxury, has to be dismantled. So the farmer shows he has confidence in himself, unlike the company, which is so worried about the fragility of its image that it tries desperately to buy back the vehicle. Then verse 2 continues the definition with a biblical allusion. Jesus had urged his disciples to demonstrate their difference from others by their readiness to go the extra mile or to offer more help than they had been asked to give. Quote, and whosoever shall tempt thee to go a mile, go with him twain, give to him that asketh thee, and from him that would borrow of thee, turn not thou away. So the Australian reality of great distances across the country is described here with the suggestion that sprawl is a matter of generous excess for the sake of others. It is an attitude that can concern itself with others because it proceeds from a sense of quiet self assurance. The Rococo school of art is associated with 18th century Europe, and its distinguishing feature is the decoration based on delicacy and grace. Similarly, sprawl can be allowed its access because it proceeds from an inner poise or personal stillness at the center of activity. Sprawl is not vaguely ostentatious, nor does it flaunt itself to show off another's poverty. So these poems actually tell us about the contradictions and the similarities in two poets, Thou and Murray, and share their common concerns and anxieties. Both the poets try to explore a particular phase of national consciousness. It's a development of a recognizably contemporary Australian voice. At Swadesh funeral, the quality of sprawl depend on the long, relaxed line, although from for different regions. The first poem uses it to intensify the sense of elegy, and the second to set out a working definition. In both the cases, though, it is made deliberately colloquial to evoke the rhythms of daily speech. Australia emerges as the common cultural denominator, not just because uh, Kurang uh, is substituted for magpie, but also because, as in the quality of sprawl, all cultural referents, whether historical, geographical, or legendary, are measured against contemporary Australia. Another concern shared by the poem is their analysis of states of mind under the contemporary pressures. The stresses of urban and suburban life are examined, although in different ways. Rootlessness, meaningless relationships, and school alcohol abuse color the life of Swagger. Rootlessness recurs in the quality of sprawl, although here it fuels the impulse of cultural redefinition in various contexts. Blood, on the other hand, plays off not just an urban edge against a rural dweller, but two different ways of life shaped by different needs and influences. To sum up, we can say safely that Bruce Lee analyzes in his poem at Swadesh funeral the implication of suburban life for the individual and the community at a moment of loss. The social and economic dislocations of suburbia are seen to create an emotional rootlessness as well. Les Murray explores psychological attitudes, both national and personal, in the quality of sprawl and blood. Both poems work out different kinds of cultural uh, redefinition. The that poems of Dai and Murray share the concerns, the following concerns: an exploration of national consciousness through the poem of Prism of Suburbia, an analysis of various states of mind, and a contrast between temporal and eternal values. So this brings us to unit number 3, and where we'll analyze uh, Chris Wallace, Krabbe, and Win Harwood. These these poets also has set the Australian contemporary poet afloat with their powerful lines, powerful poems. Chris Wallace Krabbe, born in 1934, taught at the University of Melbourne. One of his students here was Bruce Doyle, which we have covered in Unit 2, and indeed a section of one of Wallace Krabbe's major poetic sequences entitled Losses and Recoveries is dedicated to die. I the memory keeper to the is also fresh in our mind, which Crabbe uses to good effect. Wallace Crabbe plays in some of his poems. This poem, in this poem, he recalls die, and it is referred just quote, film has no tenses. The latest pundit says poems have tenses and nostalgias, though, like anything. And when I get to think of the mid 50s, flushing through my slides, I see you slow past chemistry, blue chin and blue chinned in military shirt, and a maroon figured art silk tie. The idea that poetry has its own tensions and nostalgias is central to an understanding of Wallace Grab. His concern is not simply to evoke the presence of Bruce Lee, a fellow poet and an old student, but importantly, to evoke a specific time, the 1950s, and a specific place, Melbourne. Melbourne in the 50s was a place of critical change, a notion that it is developed in the prescribed poem as well. Memory, cityscape, and the political commitment. Note the reference to the military shirt of they who had done a stint in the Royal Australian Air Force as against the printed silk tie associated with the typical poet come together in the poetry of Wallace Crabbe. They also come together in his critical writing. As assistant editor of the Oxford Literary History of Australia, Melbourne 1998, and as a university teacher, he has been concerned with the formation of critical opinion and public taste in the area of Australian literature, which until recently has been relatively unexplored. So, when he recalls, as he does both in losses and recoveries, the topography of various cities and his mindscape, it must be remembered that he intends to form public opinion as a poet and as a critic, or indeed as a pundit. This puts him in the forefront of analyzing the way in which land and sea or city and university act upon each other. Then Green Harwood, 1920 to 1925, taught music at a school in Brisbane before moving to Tasmania following her marriage in 1945. A homemaker and the mother of four children, many of her poems deal with the complicated legacies of white blood, wifehood, and motherhood, as these alter the options open to women. For example, her poem "Person to Person" explores a meeting between the speaker and her former lover in a dream, and the interruption of their meeting by the child of the speaker. Quote, I reach to take your hand, and a thorn from the uh, rose vine rakes blood from my wrist. I cannot hear what you say as a child comes to wake me by scraping his nails on my arm. Who grows old in a dream? Who can taste the ripe fullness of absence? And who can summon by light the incredible likeness of sleep from this fading dream? As useless now, a ton of wing, as a ton of wing, I wake to embrace the stubborn presence of life. So here we see Harwood at its best, at her best, and we will move to another poem, Melbourne. Uh, the poem is very interesting and very popular during time. Then the historical background is the founding of the city of Melbourne and the social and cultural elements that color it. In 1851, Victoria gained its separate identity as a colony, with Australia, with its captain named Melbourne after Queen Victoria's first Prime Minister. Its origins, however, were treated with some reservation. A poem written by Rudyard Kipling a couple of generations after the founding of the city has Melbourne offer this description of herself. Quote, greeting, nor fear nor favor, own of the place. Go between greed of gold and dread of drought, loud voiced and reckless at the wild tide race that whips our harbour mouth. The origins of the city of Melbourne, got between greed of gold and the dread of drought, are presented unattractively but accurately in the above lines. The hungry 40s, that is the 1840s, were a period of starvation and unemployment in Britain that drove people to seek their fortunes elsewhere, frequently in the new territories of Australia, such as Victoria. 1851, the year when it acquired a separate political identity, was also the year when gold was discovered in Victoria. With the onset of the gold rush, People flocked to Victoria and prosperity ensured. There is a story that only two policemen were left in the city of Melbourne, as the rest had left to go prospecting for gold. So, between the twin compulsion of need and greed, the city of Melbourne developed. Let us come to the poem Losses and Recoveries, the social cultural context of Melbourne, which refers to the socio-economic cultural context of Melbourne. Melbourne, quote, Melbourne holds all, hands, lips, bodies, all that we are, it feeds, and feeds upon. Many would go but drag the city with them, worldwide, wherever they push and flee. Here, look now, all this is ourselves, and up over the dull blue skyline dangles a bright eastering tea jet, the color of hope. Unquote. The relationship between the city and its people is complex. The people are of the city and carry it within themselves as a part of their inmost being, wherever they go and however hard they try to escape it. At the same time, the city feeds or preys upon its people. Ultimately, the city and its people are indistinguishable. The only hope they have of redemption and a new life of is ironically the T-jet, a fight aircraft that symbolizes death. Recalling the Vietnam War, the social and cultural context shared by the city of Melbourne and its people is against this complicated heritage, fraught and sometimes unhappy. The people may be of the city even when they are not in it, but this intense bonding itself may prove destructive. The literary context is even more interesting. The idea of the poet addressing a city on its quality of life is one that it is and that is at least as old as the classical Latin poetry written during the reign of Augusta Caesar. This kind of city poetry was arrived during the 17th and 18th centuries in England, and John Dryden's Meg-Plecno 1682 is a good example of this kind of writing. I will use we can use the following extract from Meg-Plecno to illustrate certain characteristics of city poetry, since we have a strong belief that Wallace Craft's Melbourne can be usefully examined in this context. The Augusta to which Dryden refers here is London, and the Barbican is the old wall built by the Romans to protect London during their conquest. Quote, close to the walls which fair Augusta bind, the fair Augusta much to fierce inclined, an ancient fabric raised to inform the sight, then stood of yore, and Fabricant it high, a watch tower once, but now so fate ordains, of all the pile an empty name remains. What are the features of city poetry and that can be isolated from this extract? Uh, the first thing is the use of satire, Fair Augusta is the most obvious example of mockery, since, as Dryden goes on to show, London is not beautiful but ugly, a place of pointless ruins. Uh, Next and related to this is the way which this kind of poetry draws a clear parallel between the life of a city and the mind of its people. If the people are caught in the grip of political uncertainty, as they are in Black Placon, the city in turn will seem paralyzed with fear. Then, following from the notion of satire, comes corollary that the poet establishes a contrast between the real and the ideal. In this case, the past of the city of London is shown to have a meaning and a purpose which it lacks in time present. Finally, and most importantly, is the role of the poet in the city poetry. The poet sees himself as the custodian of the cultural values of a city at a time when all other people have deserted the city and she is no longer true to herself. In these lines, for instance, Dryden implies that even though the ancient watch tower is now a crumbling ruin, the poet can and will stand forth as a watchman to police and protect the walls of his city. If the poet did not care for his city, he would not get to so disappointed in her. In city poetry, the poet's anger against his city is in direct proportion to his feeling for her. Now, the text of Melbourne begins with a disclaimer. The city, we are told, is not located on the ocean but overlooks a, a off bay. The bay in question is, of course, Botany Bay, a convict settlement in the 18th century. Now, however, it is still to it still to the point of stagnation. Fish are easily had and city fattens on the fertile soil around the bay. Then comes the turnaround. Quote, if a surf beats, it is faint and far away. If slogans blow around, we stay at home. In other words, just as the waters of the bay are peaceful because they are recessed away from storm-tossed ocean, ocean waves. The mind of the city is similarly shut away from all meaningful thought and controversy, whether specifically political or over Vietnam, perhaps, or more general social issues. The citizens of Melbourne, and this is the criticism made in verse 2, are as sluggish of action and thought as are the mild waters of the way. The action always happens elsewhere. All shades of political commitment, nationalist, the patriot, the terrorist, the guerrilla, or victim, the refugee, can be seen in Melbourne only on the new news reels and documentaries in town. Commitment does not move or touch these people at all. It is for other, more torrid zones on which the sun of oppression beats down. Now, with this, we have mm, come to another poem in the park uh, with Green Herod once offered the following catalog: love, friendship, art, memory. The surprising omission of landscape from this list has itself been thought to suggest something of a social context of her poetry, which derives from quote unquote her resistance to identification with recognizably nationalist preoccupation. The sense of suburbia that is generated in one of its victims, in this case a woman, is very significant here. A woman in suburbia is marginalized by both place and gender. While it is true that both the women and the men remain unnamed, she is shown to be distinctly shabby, while he is neat. We are not told how many children the woman has, but she is accompanied by four: the two who whine and bicker, a third who gropes around in the dark, and a fourth who is not yet weaned. The next point made is that the forces of sex and gender, respectively biological necessity and cultural conditioning, have imprisoned the women. She points out strongly that her children have fed off her. They the concluding line, which she has courage to entrust only to the wind, makes this point clearly. Quote unquote, they have eaten me alive. She has been destroyed, in other words, by the biological demands of childbearing and child rearing. Simultaneously, she also feels she is pressured by the sacrifices and the statements contemporary patriarchal society expects a wife and a mother to mouth, sentiments that are culturally acceptable. Hence, her dependence on platitudes. It's so sweet to hear their chatter, watch them grow and thrive, when in reality her situation is the reverse of sweet. There is also the point that the contemporary sociocultural pressures dehumanize all the people, both men and women. Harwood's portrayal of the man speaks about this. Is he a person or a puppet? His social reflexes condition him to make a casual nod to an old acquaintance of whose love in the past he had not been aware. The greatest causality in this situation is that of a human personality. The man has been reduced to the level of a neat little caricature in a comic strip. All these responses are programmed rather than real. Hence, the real in his very thoughts seem to come out in the bubble form. Just as characters in cartoon strips have their thoughts and speech printed in a roughly oval space that is outlined by the artist. Finally, the sonnet explores the relationship between language and feeling. As a rule, it seems that within the social context of contemporary suburbia, language is used to escape from emotion. And some brief moments of intercourse is very interesting here. How nice, etc. Time holds great surprises, but for the grace of God, and of course, the remark already discussed, it's so sweet to wear the charter, watch them grow and thrive. Only right at the end does the speech convey emotion when the woman says obliquely, "They have eaten me alive." This comment is heard only by the wind and is an expression of a pent up feeling that will not be held in check any longer. The near total rift between language and feeling is a measure of the rift or alienation between one person and another, and also of the rift within a single individual herself. These gaps are caused by the pressures of contemporary society. Then we come to the literary context. The poem in the park is a sonnet. The word sonnet means a little song in Italian. The sonnet is a form of poetry that originated in Italy in the 13th century, and Petrarch, an Italian poet, 1304 to 1343, popularized this verse form. And Harwood's sonnet is based on the Petrarchan model. That is, the 14 lines are divided into an octave comprising 8 lines and a sestet comprising 6. The rhyme scheme of the Petrarchan sonnet is A B A B A B A B C D C D E. This structure is used to communicate a single wave of emotion which rises to a high point at the end of the octave and then ebbs away through the sestet, which either complements or responds to the emotion of the octave in its own way. Then we will come to see the common concerns between the two poets. Uh, Wallace Grab and Harwood suggest that both alter the inherited paradigm of the Australian landscape that they use. The stereotype with which you uh, you are familiarized now is the dichotomy between the city and the bush. With these poems, it seems that this traditional dichotomy, opposition, is no longer obtained. The opposition is no longer between culture and nature. Instead, rifts and fissures open up within the world of civilization itself. Wallace Crabbe's poem protests the stagnant complacency of the mind of Melbourne, which is reflected in the city and the way that laps its source. Excuse me. Harwood's sonnet protests the dehumanization imposed on women by suburbia. Also, the voice of protest in both poems is that of a single individual. It is a voice crying the wilderness at the speakers. The poet in Melbourne, the women in the park express the in life that characterizes the environments in which they are placed. The voice of protest in both cases is marked by its vulnerability and frustration on account of the insensitivity of its surroundings. To sum up, Chris Wallace Crabbe castigates the self-enclosed and self-preserving quality of the city of Melbourne in his poems of this eponymous poem. In the tradition of the city poet, he adjures Melbourne to rouse itself politically and culturally as it is. He believes in a uh, torpor of emotion and intellectual apathy. Green Harwood, Green Harwood analyzes the ways in which contemporary suburbia constructs stereotypes of wifehood and motherhood that destroy women. Her sonnet in the park is a searing indictment of the way contemporary society feeds on women and denies them access to opportunities of self-development, of self-identity. Now, with this, we'll come to unit number 4, where we will analyze Ethan Huang and Kevin Gilbert's poems. In contemporary Australian poetry or Australian literature in general, multiculturalism is perhaps the single distinguishing feature of Australia today, that it sets it apart from the country as it was during the aftermath of World War II. Um, the writer recalls his upbringing during the World War II and contrasts it with the reality of life in contemporary Australia. Um, Quote, you might say that my upbringing was monocultural, in fact, classically colonial, in the sense that it concentrated on the history, literature, and values of women Western Europe, and in particular of England, and not much else. It had very little relationship to the themes of education in Australia today, which place a heavy stress on local history, the culture of minorities, and compensatory non-Anglo-centric approach to all social questions. Multiculturalism reflects a reality that the person on the bus next to you in Sydney is just as likely to be the descendant of a relatively recent arrival, a small trader from um, Coplios, a mechanic from Palermo, a cook from Saigon, a lawyer from Hong Kong, or a cobbler from some still in Lithuania, as the great grandchild of an Englishman or Irishman, transported or free. The length of one's roots, as distinct from the tenacity, is no longer a big deal, where whatever passing pangs of regret this may induce in the minority of Australians whose families have been there for most of its white history. By the 1970s, Australia had ceased to be a basically British country anyway, and there was no feasible way of persuading the daughter of a Croatian migrant of the mystic bond. She was supposed to feel with Prince Charles or his mother. This is a quotation from Hawes. What are the consequences of a shift from monoculturalism to multiculturalism likely to be for poetry? The map of contemporary Australia is very much more a collage of ethnicities. The extended quotation that you have just discussed suggests the unbelievable cultural pluralism that can result when a cross section of ethnic groups, Mediterranean and Central European races, live together. Poetry then is likely to present a far wider range of voice and experience than before. The mood of optimism that colors the extract may not always be present, though, and the extent to which poetry reflects a shift from Anglo-centric models may possibly vary as well. So, coming to the poem by Ed Tian Hong, and we'll read the literary context of the poem because we are already familiar with the multicultural context. The literary context of coming to is a little more complicated to set out. It seems to make a rite of passage or a phase of development in a way that draws attention to its literary ancestry. When Hung reminds his readers of the lyric Sailing to Byzantium written by Irish poet William Butler Yeats in the early part of 20th century, Yeats' poem concerns a passionate journey of the imagination to a city of the mind. Byzantium, present-day Istanbul, capital of Turkey, is chosen by Yeats because in the ancient world it represented the artistic achievement born out of a confluence of cultures, Greek, Roman, and Christian. Although Hong's disclaimer comes quickly to remind his readers that coming to is no sailing to Byzantium any more than it is a suicide note. It is clear that Hong's is also a poem about a journey made towards some kind of cultural experience that is composite or pluralistic. As with sailing to Byzantium, this journey of the mind presupposes and increases self knowledge and self recognition. Then we will come to the text of coming to. The text of coming to is constructed on a pun, which is the title of the poem. On one level, it is a poem about speakers regaining consciousness after a car accident, in which the car is practically submerged by a river in speed, and the poet manages to escape after having briefly fainted. On another level, the poet comes to an understanding of his situation as an immigrant. When he recovers his senses, the husband and wife who have stopped to help him ask from where has come. So far, he has regarded himself as an Australian, one who has at last, like Captain Cook, reached the firm ground of Australia after undergoing perilous waters. He has thought of the Australian couple, presumably of Caucasian origin, as fellow citizens. Now, with a shock, he looks at himself through their eyes and realizes what they see as his foreignness. Jesus, what on earth is the unspoken parenthetical response of such people to the presumably Asian origins of the speaker? Nonetheless, the speaker scores an ironic triumph at the end. His response to the woman's question, "Where you from? Where are you from?" is Perth. In other words, he gives his country of citizenship, that is Australia, to which he now belongs, rather than his country of birth, from where he has emigrated. The Caucasian Australians, he is an immigrant, but he sees himself as an Australian. Down under is another phrase sought through with irony. The phrase was originally used by the English to describe Australia derisively as being the country right at the base of the known world. For an Australian to use this term to describe himself would be a comic turnaround, like turning the tables, or one who seems to be merely an immigrant to those who look at him. The hijacking or appropriation of the phrase is an act of courage. He is resolute to claim equal status as an Australian in a multicultural society in good standing. In short, he comes to an understanding of the complexities of his position. So, other poem is Mr. Man by Kevin Gilbert. This text uh, returns instinctively and repeatedly to its title, Mr. Man, is the term used by the speaker as he berates the Caucasian judge and makes a series of rhetorical demands of him and of the culture he represents. Not how the poem depends for, Not how the poem depends on its ordering, on the rhymes or rhythms of Pitkin, since these may be seen to order indigenous experience. Formal punctuation is therefore minimal, as also it is noticed that just a single individual who is on trial, but an entire system of values is also present. At the outset, the right of the judge and the culture he represents to hand down the law is questioned. It is shown to be a right that has no basis in felt experiences. Its central premise is that the experience of the indigenous people unites them with the cosmos, the birds and the clouds and the trees, the sun and the moon and the breeze talk to me, are of me, they dwell inside me. This premise lends a sacredness and an authenticity to the relationship between these people and the land. Have you entered the caves and greeted your own totems there? The point is that the spirit of the indigenous people is stamped indelibly on land on the land. The future of the throne land throws back or reflect their features. People of Caucasian origin have to understand that it is only limpid water in which they can see themselves. To sum up, Yi Tiang Huang in Coming To and Kevin Gilbert in Mr. Man seek to challenge mainstream culture by opening up the walls of immigrant and indigenous experience respectively. Coming To is an exercise in self-recognition as an immigrant who suffers a road accident comes to understand the acceptance of the fact of his Australian identity is hard to come by. Mr. Man overturns the attempt of Caucasian society to claim cultural supremacy by pointing out the primal claim of ownership of the land mm, belongs to the indigenous people. Both poems seek to redefine Australian identity by articulating protests from the margins. And they share a common problem. Does the representation of a cultural group in its separateness empower or enfeeble it? Now, with this, we will come to the last unit, unit number 5, where we will discuss Madru, Nardin, and Gig Rian. Of course, briefly, uh, Modro Nordyan and Gig Rian are two contemporary poets who preferred names which draw attention to the theoretical positions from which they write. The former is the preferred usage of Colin Johnson. By using it, Norogin deliberately focuses on the fact that he wants to privilege indigenous experience and identity over a conventionally more suitable and anglicized identity. Harjan I will try. It is seen that also asserts a solidarity with the untouchables of India. Um, Both the indigenous people in Australia and the Harijans in India are people against whom social and cultural discrimination is practiced in the land of their birth on account of their origin. Narrowing implies that it is possible for oppressed classes of the world to unite, setting aside national boundaries in response to the common discrimination they face. A gig is a single event performance of popular music, and Elizabeth or Gig Ryan is a singer and a songwriter as well as a poet. She has from also worked on a Melbourne women writers magazine Luna. Ryan articulates the voice of a radical feminist protest. The text of Horzan is constructed around a central paradox. On the one hand, the term suggests that, owing to the intervention of Gandhi, the outcasts have at least been set up as a chosen people. On the other hand, this sense itself becomes self defeating. They have no blessed inheritance, no paradise into which to step, no promise of a bright future awaits them, and in time present they are only the certainties of various forms of social and moral oppression. This paradox is expressed through a set of concepts borrowed from the Jews of the Old Testament. At one point, they were ruled by the Egyptians and believed that, as God's chosen people, they would be led by Him out of slavery into the promised land of deliverance. One of the ironies of the poem is that if the Harijans obtain liberation, it will be on the basis of their own effort. Another continuing and tragic irony is that just as Gandhi's identification of them as the people of God is a mixed blessing, freedom for India has not necessarily meant their liberation. They believe they have won their own freedom and secured their own dignity. The hyperbole or exaggeration for the sake or of effect is the governing mode of the poem. It is constructed on the set of premises that are deliberately non-realistic on the level of observable fact. All the premises to which the poem responds are in turn based on the double standards on which a gendered society operates. For example, the cultural stereotyping, which believes that men's thoughts are profound because they deal with the public world, which while women's thoughts are trivial because they deal with the private world, is shown up in its ugliness. The poem deliberately uses grotesque images centering around sex and violence to evoke the horror of lovelessness in a contemporary world. The tone of the poems remains colloquial throughout, but the spoken voice is one of the great anger, particularly when it describes the sexual union in terms of ugliness alone. I, the Rather than a monologue, it seems to work through the relentless incremental effect. Words and images on just one um, theme seem to pile up and give the poem the force that it has. A monologue would would have worked through the logic of argument rather than the accumulation of examples and illustrations. So, to sum up, contemporary Australia responds to social cultural challenges arising from republicanism and the aftermath of Vietnam, immigration, suburbanization, and the experiences of indigenous people and women. Bruce Dye analyzes the pressures of suburbia, while Les Murray anatomizes national and psychological attitudes. Chris Wallace Cribb castigates the emotional and intellectual torpor of he sees as a characteristic of city life, while Ewan Harwood examines the psychological and emotional trauma suburbia can induce in women. Yi Tang Hong exposes the ignorance and arrogance with which white Australians can confront immigrants and uh, Kevin Gilbert opens up the alienation written into the indigenous experience. Um, Mordoro Nerogin sees a parallel in the discrimination encountered by Harijans in India, while Gig Ryan radicalizes feminist protest. So, this is Australian contemporary poetry in a nutshell for you all, and we can see that these things bring us to Australia in its multicultural context, and we can develop a sense of belongingness to this kind of poetry, where rootedness and landscape and place, the change, social context, war, Vietnam context, all the things come to carry the contemporary Australian poetry forward. Thank you. Thank you for today, and I will give any suggestion you want in the WhatsApp group, and I will add two names which you gave me yesterday. Um, and if you have any problems, we can. Uh, um, it's a not a MEG-3, it's a MEG-9. Okay. Mm, the query from Keshav Markar, it is felt that you are mistaken, and it is all about MEG-9 Australian literature, and today we have covered up Australian contemporary Australian poetry, right? And if you have any problems, I will include you in the WhatsApp group, because yesterday I was busy preparing the slides, and maybe tomorrow we have a break, so I can do that. Please bear with me, and I hope you have at least got into the cream of Australian contemporary poetry, and we have to consider all the things when we approach contemporary Australian poetry. And thank you for today.